Look at me.
You got one? What? Who needs one?
It's all.
All right. Thanks. Who needs a copy?
Mom does, and
Ever.
pass them out. Anybody?
Okay, there you go.
Does anybody else want one? They're only $1.
$1. You make a business here.
Yeah.
No, Debbie and Barb are up in Cedar Rapids today. So yeah, there is no bulletin back there because I didn't have a template. I guess I could have printed something out, but Debbie's the one that has the template. So I told her it'd be all right. We can go off of last week's. So, all right, this morning we are back on our series. We are looking at cards 51 through 60. And last week or the week before, we looked at John, a lot about John. And who else did we look at? Luke, John and Luke. Trying to remember. It's been 2 weeks. John and Luke. And so today we're going to look more at Andrew and Peter. And Philip is also mentioned a couple times, but it looks like we're going to spend more time talking about Philip next week. So we won't spend a lot of time on him, but more just on Andrew and Peter. And so the first one is card 51, the three apostles from Bethsaida. And so somebody want to pick up and read in John chapter 1. And we're going to have several cards from about verse 40 through 44. Let me just read the section.
One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first findeth his own brother Simon and saith unto him, We have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus, and when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah, thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. The day following Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip, and saith unto him, Follow me. Now Philip of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter.
All right, so here we read about Andrew, Simon, and Philip, and they're from Bethsaida. So Bethsaida is the area. Get a map here. Bethsaida is right here. So right on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, around Capernaum and that area. So there was a town named Bethsaida, but there was also the region right in there was Bethsaida. And so Andrew, Simon, and Philip. And we're going to figure out, which you probably know, another name for Simon, which is Peter. But we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So we'll talk about Philip a second. Philip brought Nathanael to Christ and saw his magnificence. And so we read 43 through 44. So we want to pick up in verse 45 through 48. Actually, through the end of the chapter.
Philip found Nathanael and said to him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of the Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Peter said to him, Come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said to him, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, How do you know me? Jesus answered and said to him, Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said to him, Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, Most assuredly, I say to you hereafter, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man.
All right, so now we're talking about Philip for a second. So one thing about him, it's interesting, he was seemed to be have an evangelistic desire. Because the first thing he meets Jesus tells him to follow him. And Philip understood who Jesus was. Now, I'm sure there's some dialogue between here and some things that happen between this time that's not recorded. But we do find Philip going out and talking to who? Who did he go get? Nathaniel. He goes and gets Nathaniel, and he brings Nathaniel to them and to Jesus. And it's interesting because what Nathaniel said in verse 46, and it says, and Nathaniel said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Where's another place we see that? We talked about this a little bit. In Acts chapter 2. They remember in Acts chapter 2 when they were looking at the apostles who were speaking, and they said, how can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's the same thing. They were all from that area. And Nathaniel had that same thought. He's like, there's no way that anything good, a prophet, not only that, but notice Philip said in verse 45, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. He understood who Jesus was. He understood the prophets and he understood the writings. And so he sends Nathanael to him. And I love the fact that here in verse 47, it says, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. And verse 48, Nathanael asked the question, how do you know you? How do you know me? And it says, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And so Jesus showed his deity right there, because Nathanael was somewhere else and he was under a fig tree. And Jesus said, when I saw you there, I knew who you were. And Nathanael understood right then that this was no normal person, because he wasn't just an eye shot of Jesus at that point. Jesus understood. Jesus knew him, and Nathanael understood his deity. And so this is where we talk about a little bit about Philip. But like I said, we're going to talk about Philip more next week. We're going to specifically spend more time talking about Andrew and Peter. And so the first thing was Andrew and Simon's house was not far from the synagogue in Capernaum. Somebody read Matthew 8 and verse 5. And like last week, a lot of the information that we're going to cover this week or the week before is just information. These cards are more focused just on information about these two characters. And so here's just some information about where they lived. Somebody read Matthew 8:5.
And when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion beseeching him.
Okay, verse 14 now.
And when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid and sick of a fever.
All right, so he's in 8:5, he's in Capernaum. 14, he goes into Peter's house. So what does that tell you? Peter's house is in Capernaum. All right, Mark chapter 1 now, verse 21 and 29. I won't just jump on you there. I had you done another one too.
Nope.
Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. That was 21.
Okay, 29.
29.
Mhm.
And forthwith,
Where we go.
when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John.
All right, so Andrew and Peter's house were in the area of Capernaum and close to a synagogue. And that's just what we can determine from that. So we're kind of getting an idea of where they lived. And we're going to talk about Peter more, but in the fact that Andrew's house was not far from the synagogue. But here's another interesting thing. Let's go to John chapter 6 and talking about Philip and Andrew. We're not going to read all this, but John 6, 1 through 15. We have the feeding of the 5,000. And we're going to let's start in somebody read verse 6 and 7.
And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 penny worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little.
All right, so if we read the whole context, in the feeding of 5,000, Jesus lift up his eyes and seeing a great multitude in verse 5 coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that we may eat? And so verse 6 tells us he was testing Philip. And at this point, they've been together for a long time, for a while. What do you think Philip has seen through this period of time with Jesus? What do you think he's seen Jesus do? Miracles. Done miraculous things. And he knows who Jesus is. We already stated that back in John chapter 1. He's been with Jesus for a period of time. He's seen the miracles. And Jesus asked him, where are we going to buy bread to feed all these people? Now, what is Philip's first reaction? We don't have enough money. He's like, well, we got to, we think about it. He's talking about the fact that it would take 3/4 of a year's wages just to buy enough bread to feed all those people. That's where his mind went.
But I think he's just thinking without really thinking about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's thinking, he's trying to think materialistically in the sense of saying, okay, we don't have enough cash to buy all this. And that's what Jesus asked. But he could have said, we don't need money. You're right here. And so in a sense, we've kind of seen his personality. He could have that idea, that pessimistic idea, and the thinking of not looking at what was in front of him. But then didn't want to assume. Could be. But look at what Andrew said in verse 8 and 9. So let me read that.
One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many?
Okay, so Jesus' question was to buy, and so Philip, he's thinking money. Andrew, he says, wait a second, there's a kid here. The lad means a young child who has this food. We could use it, but there's still not enough. So they both were not thinking about the miraculous or what Jesus can do. They were thinking in the physical, but we kind of see where their mind's going. Their faith was not as strong as it probably should have been. And I mean, you think about being in their situation, what would you do? Where would your mind go?
Same thing.
I think it would go the same way. I don't have enough money. We don't have enough food. How can you feed these people? And so we can't look down upon them and say, well, they should have known. They should have had stronger faith, because I think we would have had the same idea if we were in their position. And so, but we see this interaction between Jesus and Philip and Andrew here. So that's card 51.
But he fed the disciples first, in my opinion, to remind them of what his abilities are before he fed the multitude.
Yeah, because he was showing them and teaching them, and he did it again in another place. But yeah, to teach them. And a lot of the things Jesus did was to teach them. Because what was he preparing the apostles for, or the disciples for? When he would leave. And the fact that when he left, that they would definitely know. And to where John, like we talked about last week, could write 1 John, the things that we've seen and heard, we know. He knew who Jesus was, and he could be a witness of who Jesus was. And so a lot of these things were to show them that he was deity and who he was. All right, that's card 51. Card 52, the brother of Simon. Andrew. So John 1:40. Some of these cards, I'm telling you. Yeah. All right. So John 1:40. And so Andrew, the word means the mighty one or conqueror. That's what his name means. He was the father of John or Jonas in other places. Somebody read 1 John 1:42 first. Or John 1:42, not 1 John.
And he brought him to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, You are Simon the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is translated as stone.
Okay, so it says Jonah here, chapter 21 now, verse 15.
So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Feed my lambs.
All right, so Jonah again. And so Jonas in some translations and John in some translations, it can be translated either way. And so that just gives us a little bit more information who Peter or Simon and Andrew's father was. Card 53, Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. And so that was in John 1 and verse 40. We'll read that again.
On part 52, you have that his father, okay, sorry, I read that wrong.
I may have typed something wrong too.
No, I thought you wrote that he was the father. I read it backwards.
Okay.
My bad, I'll be quiet.
All right. Somebody read John 1:40 again.
One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother.
Okay, so talking about John, that is John the Baptist. And so Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist first. And so that's just a little more information we have on him. And like I said last week, we do not have a lot of information on the apostles, their back history. We have more on their future and what they did in the future. And we don't really have a lot on Andrew. And so we're talking about Andrew.
Jonah and Jonas is the same person.
It's just the way it's translated. In some translations, they have John too. So it could be either three. All right. So Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. But it's kind of interesting in what John, the writer of John, says here in verse 40, that one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew. But he does not mention who the other one was. But as we talked about with John, does John mention himself in the book of John? No. A lot of times he says the other disciple, or he'll say the one that Jesus loved. He never mentions himself. And so there's a possibility that John himself was another follower of John the Baptist. So him and Andrew both were. And that's what he didn't mention himself here in this verse. So it's just a little bit of information on that. The next card, card 54. Andrew brought his brother, Simon Peter. And that's John 1:40 again. So we're still in the same section.
Can you read that again?
Yeah, you want to read it again? No. Like I said, some of these cards, I'll tell you. Cephas is, so you look at the name, Cephas is Hebrew. And so if you look at John 1:40, it's translated stone. Where do you see that being used in another passage where Peter is called a stone?
Rock that I'll build my church.
Yeah, in Matthew 16:18, it says, and thou art Peter, which means stone, and upon this rock, which is a different word, and it's not referring to Peter, but his name Peter is used there in comparison with a stone as a little tiny pebble, which is what his name meant, and then a stone as in a fortified bedrock, which is Philippi where they were at, which makes sense.
Does that do like a cornerstone too, or no?
No, that's a reference to Christ. But the aspect of him being called a stone is really a sign of his character as he grows. And one thing about Peter is we can all a lot of times relate to Peter because he was one that had to grow. He started very eager, sometimes too quick to jump on things. And then as you grew, we see him becoming the person that brings the gospel to the Gentiles. And we're going to talk about that. And so Peter had different names. Cephas is Hebrew. Peter is Greek, but Peter means stone. And that's in Matthew 16:18. And then Mark 3 and verse 16. Jesus changed Simon's name because it was upon the rock of confession he stated who Jesus was. And that's Matthew 16:18 again. Jesus knew the kind of person he was going to be. And it definitely took him some time to get to that point. All right. So that's card 54. Now we're going to talk more about Peter. The occupation of Simon and Andrew. A new verse, Matthew 4 and verse 18. Somebody want to read that? Matthew 4:18.
And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon called Peter,
And Andrew's brother casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen.
All right. Who else was a fisherman, as we talked about before? John. We're talking about John as a fisherman also. And so They both were fishermen, Simon and Andrew and John. Jesus told them, he used that in Mark chapter 1, verse 16 and 18. So let me read that.
Now as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew his brother casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And Jesus said unto them, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. And straightway they forsook their nets and followed him.
All right, so Jesus told them that he would make them fishers of men instead of who they were, their occupation before. And some I don't have in this, but what did Jesus or what did Peter do after Jesus died on the cross? Where did Peter go? He went back to fishing. That's like John chapter 20. He went back to fishing, went back to his occupation. And it shows his sign of still needing to grow. He should have known that Jesus was not going to be gone forever. He should have known that he was going to rise because Jesus talked about it. But we see him go back to that trade. All right, card 56. We're flying through the cards today. We'll be here a little while. Card 56. Simon also called Cephas or Peter. And that's John 1:42, which is a passage we've already read. But Peter was a close friend to Jesus. Who is the three that are mentioned always close to Jesus as his close friend, or as ones that were always with Jesus? Peter, James, and John. So those were the three that were close friends of Jesus. And as we talk about the character of Jesus, Jesus had a great love for everybody, but still Jesus had close friends. And we see that in Peter, James, and John because of the fact that not only were they close friends, but they also got to see things that others didn't about Jesus. And one of those occasions is Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. And verse 37 is stating the passage that we're looking at. But if you read verse 36 through 43. Somebody want to read that?
As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not be afraid, only believe. And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. Then he came in, he said to them, Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when he put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with them and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kuma, which is translated, Little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat.
Okay, so here is one place where Peter, James, and John were able to go and see something nobody else did, not except for we see some of the family here. So some of the family, he sent everybody else out, but some of the family, the close family, and Peter, James, and John went in and saw Jesus perform this miracle. And it just shows that they were close to Jesus. Another occasion would be Matthew chapter 17. And somebody read verse 1 through 8.
And after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elias. While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face, and were sore afraid. And Jesus came and touched them, and said, Arise, and be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only.
All right, so Peter, James, and John again are with Jesus, and we call this the Mount of Transfiguration, and the fact where Jesus went up onto this mount with them, and he transfigured himself, and so he became something different, completely different than what he was, and he was white, he was shining, and who else was there with him?
Elijah and Moses.
Elijah and Moses. What does Moses represent? The old law. What does Elijah represent? The prophets. And so the old law consisted of the law of Moses and the prophets. And so you have Moses and Elijah there with Jesus talking to him. But then when they look, there is only Jesus left. What that represents is the fact that Jesus was greater than the Moses and the prophets, and that there will be a point where those would go away, and that Jesus would only be the one left and his law. And that's just a picture of what was coming. And it's really interesting because Peter, James, and John were the only ones that saw this. And Jesus explains in the you keep reading that he told them not to tell anybody what they saw. But here we have it recorded for us what happened. So they were able to talk about it later down the road. So once again, Peter, James, and John, including Peter, was there with Jesus in this. And then one more place, Matthew 26. Somebody read verse 36 through 46.
Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go." Am I in the right place?
Yep.
And pray over there. And he took with him Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to them, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time he went away and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let us be going to see my betrayer is at hand."
Okay, so Jesus is here at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he goes to pray, and this is right before he's arrested. But who does he take? He's going up there, he stops, he leaves the disciples, but he takes 3 people with him. And that's Peter and the sons of Zebedee. Who are the sons of Zebedee? James and John. So we talked about last week. And so Peter, James, and John again. Why do you think Jesus would have took those 3 up to the place where he prayed, close to where he prayed?
They were his closest friends.
They were his closest friends. They were ones that he wanted close to him in his hour of suffering. I mean, he was going to suffer through this time in this praying, and he wanted them close. And so he wanted their support. And so it just shows that Peter was a close friend of Jesus. So was James and John. But as we've talked about, Peter was one that had to grow. He was not hesitant to speak or act. A lot of times, who do we see speak up first? Peter. That was his personality. He was one that wanted to speak up. He was willing to jump head first into something. Is that always a good idea? No, it's not. For Peter, it showed his zeal. It showed his desire to want to do what God wanted, but it wasn't always the best thing for him to do, because sometimes he would end up saying things he probably needed to think about first. What was one of the big things that Peter said immediately without thinking? You can think of one of the biggest things they ended up not being able to hold to.
He wouldn't deny.
He wouldn't deny Christ. He was confident. He was said, "I'm not going to deny you," but he did. And he probably should have thought about that a little bit. But sometimes he made mistakes, but he was eager. And so, sometimes people just want to say something just to say something and then regret it later. I don't think that was Peter, but he was one that he was just eager. I think he really was. Impulsive is a word that may be used to describe Peter. Somebody read Matthew 14:25-32.
Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Now when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, you did not doubt." But when they got into the boat, they were asleep.
Okay. And so Peter, here they see Jesus. Everybody's afraid of what they see. And when you think about it, they're in a stormy area. There's a storm, and all of a sudden you see this figure walking across the water. It would be scary. You'd be a little surprised, a little scared what it was. And they said they thought it was a ghost. But Peter, instead of just being afraid, what does he do? I want to get out and walk on the water too. And so he does, and then he starts to sink. And a lot of times we go to this passage and we talk about Peter and the fact that he had a little faith. If he had just had the faith he needed to, he would have been able to walk to Jesus. But did anybody else get out of the boat? Nobody else had the faith. I mean, Peter was quick to react, but he also he had a strong faith. Not enough to stay on the water, but the fact that he was willing to make that leap of faith immediately. So it says a lot about him. We've talked about Matthew 16:13-19 already a little bit, where Jesus asked them who he was, and Peter makes the confession that he is the Son of God. And so there he made a great statement. But I want to read John 6:63-68.
It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. But there are some of you that believe not, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who should betray him. And he said, "Therefore said I unto you, that no man can come unto me, except it were given unto him of my Father." From that time many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. Then Jesus unto the 12, "Will ye also go away?" Then Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life."
All right, and so here Jesus, and if you read through chapter 6, Jesus teaches this. It's a hard teaching for them, for the people that were following Jesus. He said he was the bread of life, and he makes a lot of statements about how they have to eat the bread or eat him and drink of him in a sense. Now, is that literal? We're talking about literal and figurative language. No, it's figurative. But it was a teaching that a lot of disciples thought it was hard to take. And so what happened was, verse 66, many of the disciples who followed Jesus left. Now, this is close to the end of Jesus' life. And you had many people following him. Now you have many people leave. And then we get to Acts chapter 1, and we have 110 disciples meeting together in the upper room. Maybe those are the only ones left, in a sense, that would have followed Jesus. But so many had left. And so what Jesus does is he turns to his apostles and he says, "Are you going to leave too?" Now, Peter was quick to answer. And rightfully so. What Peter says is amazing. He says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." Peter understood who Jesus was. Even though it was a hard saying, he realized that Jesus is the one that has the words of life. If he wants to get to heaven, he's got to stay there. And this is a passage we can go to today to talk about how Jesus is the only way to heaven, John 14 and verse 6, and that he has the words of life. And so even though he was impulsive, he makes some good statements, and he understood who Jesus was. And we see that in Matthew 16 also. He was also confident in his loyalty. Luke 22:24. So I'm going to read that.
Do you think that the disciples that left over that thing probably thought it was literal?
I don't think it is.
No, I know it's
No, I don't think that they may have thought it was literal. I think it was just something that was hard for them to swallow, and the fact of what they were required to do. Because Jesus not only said that, but that they would have to follow him and that they would have to follow the teachings. And I think some of that was just too hard for them to swallow. And we're not told, we just know that it says here that some were without belief. They didn't have the belief that they should in Jesus. And that's all that Jesus says here. So Luke 22:24.
And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest.
All right, so read the context. It's talking about with Peter and his loyalty there. But in this dispute that came among them and what was going on. And then in Mark chapter 14, somebody read verse 27 through 31.
Did you say 13 or 14?
14. Mark 14.
27 to 31?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. But Peter said to him, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. And Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he spoke more vehemently, if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said likewise.
All right, so here Peter makes this statement that he would not deny Christ. And of course, we could read later that he did. And even to the point, I didn't have it written down. One of the accounts says that the third time when Peter denied Christ, Jesus was being moved from one place to another. And that when he did that, Jesus turned to him and looked at him. Could you imagine the thought going through Peter's mind? To be the third time and then to see Jesus look at you?
Gives me goosebumps just to think of it.
It does. Why do you think he went and wept bitterly? You know, that feeling of I failed right there. And I did exactly what I said I wasn't going to do.
Did he have a choice? I mean, it was already said it's going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did he have, I mean, I know he has more agency, but it was already set in stone that he was going to do it.
Yeah.
And that's tough because he couldn't have not done it.
Well, exactly. And that's the thing about the knowledge of God. He knows what's going to happen in the future, even though man still has a free will ability to do what they want. Peter could have not done it, but Jesus knew he was going to. And that's the thing about future things, future events. It is. It's hard for us to understand how God can know the future, even though we have free will.
Those 2 things they don't compute in my head.
No.
Well, you know, you didn't try to argue with him anymore after that. Jesus knew. It's like, you're not going to be able to change his mind.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same about Judas. Jesus knew from the beginning when he first met him what Judas was going to do. But Judas followed him for 3.5 years. He made his choices throughout that. And if you follow the life of Judas, you can see the times that he was stealing from the money. He was more focused on money all the way through. And so, yeah, it's hard to fathom in our minds how God can know the future like that.
I'm not worried about it. I just
Yeah.
understand it.
Yeah, but we know he can because throughout all the prophecies, we're going to talk about that in our sermon, some prophecies from Zephaniah. And so the fact that God knew the future, and it happened just like he said. And so even though...
Again, not to interrupt you, then once again, if he doesn't know the future, then he's not got, you know.
Exactly.
On the other hand, so,
Yeah. No, if none of this stuff had happened, even to the point of Peter, If Jesus had said, you're going to deny me 3 times, and Peter didn't,
Yeah.
Jesus would not have been deity. So, yeah,
It's
it's important.
both ways.
Yeah. All right. So even though all of these things we've talked about are a negative for Peter, except for his good statements he made, he became a faithful, productive servant of God. He was the one that's recorded standing up with the 11 in Acts chapter 2. He's the one that went to the Gentiles. The half of the book of Acts is about Peter and the things that he did. And then after that, it's about Paul. There's still other things about the other apostles, but we hear more about Peter and we hear more about Paul than we do any of the others. And so, Peter, even though he had his faults, he was a very faithful and strong servant of God. And so it's just an example for us. We can have faults just like Peter, and we can learn to grow too. Another thing about him, he was married. Somebody read Mark 1:29 through 31.
Now, as soon as they had come out of the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she served them.
All right. So Peter had a mother-in-law, and then somebody read 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5.
First Corinthians 1 and verse 5.
9 and verse 5. Sorry.
Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas must said this.
There you go.
The doctor said this really confusing.
Dr. Cephas. Is that a kid's show?
No, Dr. Cephas being the good God at Bethany.
I have no
His
clue.
name's spelled the same way.
Oh, it is?
Cephas, not Cephas.
Oh, that's interesting. Ah, interesting. All right. Well, in chapter 9, Paul is defending his the right for things that he does and being an apostle. And then first, you see here, he states that, don't they have the right to take along a believing wife and things they do, just like Cephas does. And so Cephas, being Peter, was married, and his wife sometimes would go along with him in his journeys. And so Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. We'll finish these 2 things, and then we'll be done for today. Acts 4 and verse 13.
Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus.
Okay, so it's believed that he was not a formally educated person, and it was perceived here just because of the fact that he was from Nazareth, which a lot of people from Nazareth were not, and so he could have fit in that. And then the last one is John 21 and verse 18. Jesus predicted his death.
Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest.
And verse 19 also.
Oh, great.
Sorry. I like to add stuff.
This spake he, signifying by what that he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, follow him. That one was way easier.
All right. So, anyways, the Jesus predicted of his death, Peter's death, and we don't know. We don't have any record of Peter being killed for his faith, but we're told that he would be stretched out and taken somewhere he did not wish. History states that he was hung upside down on the cross. He didn't want to be hung the same way as Jesus, so he requested to be hung upside down. We don't know that. That's just tradition. As we stated before, some of this information that we get from other writers, we don't know if it's true, but that's just what tradition says or history says. And so, all right, any questions on anything? I know it's just a lot of facts. Seems like that's been the thing those last couple weeks. But we're just trying to learn about them and their character, and to realize that they're not any different than us. These men lived a life like us. Yeah, it was in a different time, different things, but they were like us. And so they were able to serve God. We can do the same today. And so, all right. Thank you guys for your time this morning.
Yeah,